All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Julia Spears. I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Academic Innovation, and I'll be moderating today's panel. We know that you have a lot of questions that have come in, and we are going to do our best to answer many questions as possible today. If we run out of time, any questions that aren't able to be answered live will be posted in the Q&A section on our website at pi.tt/student town halls. And I'll share that web address again at the end of the meeting on a screen so that you'll be sure to get it. A recording of this town hall will also be shared there along with links of valuable information. We want to make the most out of our time today, so here's how it's going to work. We have consolidated over 200 questions that we received prior, and we've put those questions together of the ones that were most frequently asked, posing the list of questions to those panelists who will respond live. Once we've gone through an initial list of questions to all of the panelists, then we will open it up for Q&A. If you're on the Zoom call, you can tap on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and submit a question. If you're joining us via the YouTube feed, you can submit your question in the comments section. Now, while all of our panelists are answering questions live, I want you to know that we also have a team of people from across the university, from housing to student health services, admissions to academics, who are also on the call, who will be behind the scenes prepared to type responses to the Q&A as well. So like I said, we will do our best to respond to as many questions as we can, either with live responses from our panelists or with type responses with the team of folks who are going to help today. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. Today, I'm joined by Kenyon Bonner, Vice Provost and Dean of Students, Amanda Godley, Vice Provost for Graduate Studies, Joe McCarthy, Vice Provost for Undergraduate Studies, Belkis Torres, who is Executive Director of Global Engagement, Steve Anderson, Associate Dean and Director of Residence Life, and John Williams, Director of the COVID-19 Medical Response Office. Thanks again for joining us all today. So let's go ahead and get started. The first set of questions will go to you, Joe. There's been a lot of questions around Flex at Pitt. So can you please explain Flex at Pitt a little bit more? Are all classes available remotely? Can a student choose which classes they prefer to take completely online versus a hybrid model? And can first-year students specifically take their entire first year virtually?
Thanks, Julia, and welcome everybody. I hope we can get a lot of questions answered for you today. I'm starting with a tough one. Flex at Pitt is very difficult to explain, but once you really wrap your head around it and you understand what we're trying to accomplish for this academic year, you'll see that it's really a powerful and incredibly adaptable structure for us to deliver the best possible education to you or your child, depending on whether you're a student or a parent or possibly both listening today. I will start off by telling you that we're working on an infographic to explain what I'm going to try and say verbally, and we will post that on the link that Julia referred to earlier, the pi.tt/student town halls website. But let me give you the quick rundown on what Flex at Pitt is. So Flex at Pitt is Pitt's version of a hybrid learning structure. And it's built in such a way that we have flexibility across a couple of different dimensions. The classes have the flexibility to adapt to what our risk posture is at the university. So as many of you know, we have 3 risk postures that we've defined depending on what the status of the pandemic is regionally. Where any of our campuses are located. And Flex at Pitt allows our courses to individually adapt to those postures as conditions change over the course of the academic year. But it also allows both the students and the faculty to adapt in real time to how they want to engage with that content. Okay, so students will, under certain conditions, have in-person classroom experiences that they can engage in, but they also have remote experiences that they can engage in, and will often have a mixture of students and faculty engaging across these different modalities. We're leveraging technology to really allow interpersonal discourse to take place in all combinations of these operations within the class. So if we get to the specific questions that Julia asked, are all classes available remotely? The answer is almost all classes are available remotely. There's a handful of classes that are really critical that they happen in a hands-on environment, like clinical, high-level clinical experiences for some of our nursing students, for example. Those can't necessarily happen remotely. Some of our laboratory classes are also hands-on enough that we can't allow those to happen remotely. But the vast majority of our classes have the option of being engaged in remotely. And students and even faculty have the option to choose and to change their mind at any time, whether they're going to engage in that experience remotely, or if they're going to take advantage of the number of physical spaces that we found where we can engage those groups together. So to get to the first year question specifically, I did check with all the first year admitting schools and the typical curriculum of all of those schools, including the nursing students. Every one of our first year students can actually stay on track and complete their entire first year curriculum completely remotely if that's what will make them most comfortable.
Great. Given that we're currently in an elevated risk posture, can you speak a little bit about how we know how each of those postures impact Flex at Pitt?
Right, great question, Julia. So elevated risk is our middle posture, right? We have guarded risk, which is our lowest risk posture. We have high risk, which is our highest risk posture. Elevated is right in the middle of the road, which is where we stand as of today. The elevated risk posture, we are allowing a small number of classes to happen in person. Those would be the classes, as I mentioned before, that are much more difficult to do remotely, the clinicals, the hands-on lab experiences. So those instructors will work with their deans to make sure they have a plan to be safely engaged in small numbers, 25 students or less, in a very physically distant spaced room. Those classes will still be in person, but the vast majority of our classes in the elevated risk posture will actually be remote classes. The high risk posture, essentially all of our classes will move to fully remote. What we're really aiming toward is when we get to that guarded risk posture, that's when we have the most flexibility at Flex at Pitt, where we're going to have classes that range in size from single digit students up to about 100 students at a time being in a physical space. But we've scoured the Oakland area of Pittsburgh and around our regional campuses to find spaces where we can actually safely distance those students so they can engage in those activities. We've outfitted those classrooms with the proper technology so that we can have group activities, for example, that engage students that are physically in the classroom with students that are remotely in their dorm or possibly in their home in Wyoming. And so we really have this flexibility across the guarded posture primarily. So if classes were to start tomorrow, there would be a very small number that would be engaged in person, and the vast majority would be remote until we changed to the guarded posture.
Thank you. I think we've gotten a lot of questions on how students can tell whether or not their classes are remote or have an in-person option. Can you see that in PeopleSoft? And if so, can you share where?
Yeah, great. So we are recording in PeopleSoft, which you can get to through your my.pitt.edu portal, right? And look at your class schedule. We are recording the location, the physical location where the in-person portion of classes is going to happen. We're doing that in real time. As you might imagine, with the distancing requirements that we have to keep all of our students as safe as possible, we do have a dramatic reduction in capacity. And so we've had to move classes all over different parts of the campus and some non-traditional buildings. And so we're not 100% completed in rescheduling those classes in terms of what room they're in. So right now, I just checked this morning, we have about 15% of our classes left to put into classrooms. But at the present time, we have about a 50-50 split at the graduate level between which of those classes are planned to be primarily remote versus which ones are planned to be in person. At the undergraduate space, it's closer to 90% of our classes will have the opportunity to be in person. But if you look in PeopleSoft today, again, through the my.pitt.edu portal, you'll be able to find classrooms listed, and those classrooms are very, very likely to not change. If it does say TBA or web TBA, it's possible that we're still looking at that 15% and trying to place those classes. Within about a week, we should finalize that process.
Great, thank you. So if it's one of the questions we received is, if we decide to elect to have a virtual semester at the start, are we locked into that decision for the semester, or can they choose to move online only if the situation worsens throughout the semester? So how much flexibility is there really in FlexitPit?
Thanks, Julia. It is really an incredibly adaptive method of teaching that we're employing here. So what we really like about this is we understand there's a lot of anxiety out there, and there's a lot of unknowns, right? We don't know how this pandemic is going to progress over the course of the fall. And so we don't want to force people to be locked into a decision that they make today, right? We want to give you that flexibility that you are going to make the best educated decision that you can as of this moment, in terms of whether you're going to return to campus and engage in person, or whether you're going to stay at home and be remote. But if a month from now conditions change and you want to switch from one modality to another, FlexitPit allows you to do that. So we are scheduling those classrooms in such a way that all of the students that we're registering for those classes have the opportunity at their choice to engage in person for those classes that have that option, or engage remotely. And they can change back and forth even within the same slate of classes. You might take 2 of your 5 classes in person and think that the other 3 are classes that you're more comfortable engaging remotely. It's completely up to the student and their own comfort level.
Okay, thank you. There's one other follow-up question. So someone wrote in saying that they had decided that they're going to do their entire fall semester completely remote. They don't live close to campus. So is there anyone they should be contacting to tell them of this decision? Is there any forms they have to fill out?
So I'll reiterate what I just said a moment ago, where we don't want to lock people in. We know it's a very stressful time and you don't have complete information. None of us has complete information. So we don't want to force you to make a decision now that's going to continue impacting you for months into the semester. So we are allowing you to change your mind as you go, but we are sending out a survey. I believe it's going to be sent out within the next 24 hours or so, that will ask students what their initial intention is. This way we can convey that information to their instructors, so the instructors can be prepared for what fraction of their classes their students on day 1 of class they expect to have in person versus remote. But again, that can change on a day-to-day basis. We're not locking anyone into any decisions that they make.
Okay, so last question for you on academics before we move on to res life and housing. How will labs and clinicals work? Will students need to be in person? When will they find out their needs for a particular lab or clinical class?
So for first year students, as I said earlier, the first year instructors of even the lab courses have worked really hard to come up with experiences that are adaptable. So you can be taking a chemistry lab and you can have a remote experience if that's what you're comfortable with. As your career continues over the course of your undergraduate studies, we may have a change in that posture. There may be some upper level labs where you actually do physically have to be in person. Again, remember that first question I answered where we said there's going to be a small number of labs and a small number of clinical experiences that will in fact be in-person only type courses. For those students that are more advanced, a little bit later in their studies, I would encourage them to reach out to their director of undergraduate studies and find out for those particular experiences, which ones have the option of being remote or in person. But the lower division labs, the introductory labs, the vast majority of those you can go ahead and do either in person or remotely.
Great, thank you so much, Joe, appreciate it. Okay, Steve, we're going to move on to you. There's been a high volume of questions coming in around housing and residence life. So the first one is, what's the difference between quarantine and shelter in place? What are the expectations of shelter in place when living on campus and in Pitt housing? And for example, how do students get food?
Thanks, Julia. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So we've used two different terms to distinguish between quarantine and shelter in place. Quarantine would be if somebody is possibly exposed to COVID and that they would be quarantining. Shelter in place is our plan for when students arrive and that they would shelter in place 7 days before arriving to their campus housing and then 7 days after they arrive to their campus housing. During this shelter in place period, they would be hanging out with their pod. So their little group of 4 to 6 students, they can go get food, do all those things that are a necessity, enjoy time outdoors together. But we are asking them to stay in their pods when they go outside and really not to interact with other pods or other groups of students during the shelter in place time period for the health of the entire Pitt community.
Great, thank you. If someone decides to take all of their classes remotely and withdraws from housing, will they be able to keep their housing guarantee for spring or for future semesters?
Yeah, and many students have asked similar questions to this. And so, yes, they can keep their guarantee if they would have their guarantee for the spring or for next year. And there's also a link that will be shared after the town hall. And we will list a link to the frequently asked questions that are similar to this one.
Thank you. There's been a lot of questions around the bathrooms. How will communal bathrooms work? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question. And especially in our communal bathroom buildings where we've done a lot of de-densifying, we will have signage up that indicates based upon the square footage, the number of students that are allowed at one time. And we'll post that information for the student. They will be, it'll be maybe, for instance, in a bathroom, maybe it limits it to 10 occupants at one time. And really, we will work as a community to keep to that number. We don't think that's going to be too big of a challenge, but we do want to make sure that we are following the guidance of our health professionals and taking that into account to keep our community healthy. Also, in addition, we have a Pitt Shines program, and our communal bathrooms will be cleaned twice per day, every day of the week, 7 days per week by our facility staff.
Okay, thank you. How many students can help with move-in? So for example, if they get a wristband, can a mom help, can the dad help move in and a mom help unpack? Like, talk a little bit about the logistics of that.
Sure, and we realize that move-in can be an exciting time and lots of folks, especially that first time, are wanting to be here. We are at this point asking that it just be one person to assist the student inside the actual building. If they want to come down and tag team each other out so that maybe one person helps carry things and another person then comes in and helps set it up, we are happy to do that. I would also encourage folks to look at our Ship to Pitt program, which we ask our students that are living on campus to ship their items by July 31st. So that would just be another way to get things here. So if you ship it to Pitt, it'll be waiting for you in your residence hall room upon your arrival.
Great. If all classes move online and residence halls are closed, will there be a prorated refund of the meal plan?
I appreciate these great questions. Thanks, Julia. Yes, it'll happen essentially like it happened last March. The halls are closed, prorated refunds will be issued. That's not our first option, and we think we're in a better prepared place to understand a little bit more about COVID and how we can maintain our community, maintain operations. As Joe was talking about how classes will operate, those are all things that we've adjusted, and we're prepared a lot better than we were last March when all of this happened. But I definitely can understand the reason for the question, and we understand that people's money and resources are valuable.
Kind of a follow-up question on the meal plan. Will freshman students be able to change their meal plan online during the add drop period if they can't go to Panther Central to fill out the paperwork since they're shelter in place in that time period?
Absolutely, Julia. There's actually, again, we'll share some of these links. I have several links to share, but there's a form online, and you do get a 2-week period during the start of the academic year to adjust your meal plan. And again, we will share the link to do that, but you actually do not need to go to Panther Central to change your meal plan.
Okay. Another question about if a student is deciding to do fall semester remote, but plans on coming back for the spring semester, How do I ensure that I get to keep my same housing spot without paying for both fall and spring?
So one, if you're planning on doing fall remote and not being here, you should reach out to Panther Central to complete the housing cancellation form, but let them know you're returning for spring semester. However, you will not keep the same spot. It will really depend upon what spots are open when you return for the spring. But if you have the housing guarantee in the fall, you will have the housing guarantee in the spring. So we will find you an accommodation. It just might not be the same accommodation depending upon what space is available at that point in time.
Okay, last question for you. Is it possible for students to negotiate housing placements out of safety concerns?
Yeah, at this point, unfortunately, we are full. We have every space on campus full, basically due to the de-densification. And so again, you can reach out with a request, but at this point, we really do not have any flexibility for housing. But I appreciate the question. If there is an accommodation need, they should reach out to our Disability Resource Services office and go through that process. And then that would be handled, DRS would make their recommendation to our housing office and they would coordinate it through there. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you so much, Steve. Kenyon, we have quite a few questions for you in regards to student life. So can you talk to us about what's going to happen with clubs and games? Can students opt to meet in person if they wish?
Yes, thank you, Julia, and all the panelists and all of you who joined us today. So that's a great question. So I think with everything on campus, we are encouraging all of our student organizations and the students who run those organizations to schedule their events remotely. That's guidance that we're releasing to the community. So just to ensure that people are appropriately following the health guidelines, we would ask, and we're asking all of our student organizations to schedule their events remotely. Depending on the posture that we're in, so if we're in a guarded risk posture where we believe that there are less restrictions on campus, and you can look at those postures on coronavirus.pitt.edu, we will allow students to schedule in-person events, but we would ask them to do those within the compliance of our guidelines. For example, the spaces that they use, as well as the number of participants and the fact that they be physically distanced from each other appropriately.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that is there any information at this time regarding campus facilities such as libraries, computer labs, printing, gym, and at what stages or operational postures would we expect to have them open?
So we're still working on individual facilities, and that information should be coming out within the next week or so. I can speak to a couple of buildings. So for example, the student union, to the extent that we have classes in session where students have the ability to go into class, particularly during the guarded phase, the student union will be open, number one, to allow students access to those classrooms in the building, and then allow students into the building for other student activities, again, appropriately following our health guidelines. As we look at other buildings like the Campus Recreation Center, yes, at a certain point in the fall semester, depending on the posture that we're in, particularly if we're in the guarded posture, we do have a plan to open our campus recreation facilities. You should not expect those facilities and campus recreation specifically to be open before the 7-day time period from the first arrival of our students, just to ensure that students are definitely following that shelter in place order. And then after that, that first group of students are able to use those facilities. And once again, we'll have guidelines in place. We'll limit the number of people in those facilities and make sure that people are appropriately spaced. There are a lot of questions about the library. We're working on the guidance for the library in terms of how that would be operated, but you should expect something similar to the other buildings that I've mentioned, a certain date that the facility will be open, and then very specific instructions on how those facilities will be used.
Okay, thank you. Switching gears just a little bit, how will you measure the efficiency of the honor code system for self-quarantining?
Great question. So, there is a lot of uncertainty during the pandemic, and but there is one thing I'm certain about. And that's if we all share as a Pitt community in this responsibility of helping to make our community safer, we will get through this together as a Pitt community. We have a plan in place, but no amount of guidance, policies, or enforcement can replace the power of us as a community, meaning faculty, staff, and students working together in the best interest of our community. Above all else, that's what we are. And it relies on the people in our community to make sure that we're keeping each other safe. So specifically, let me answer that question. We've come up with a couple of things. The first is this idea of creating a culture. And so our students this summer worked together to create what we call the Pitt Community Compact. And within that compact, they've included a number of behaviors that we believe will help us keep the community safer. And that would be something that all students would be expected to buy into and work with if they plan to be in person on campus. I commend our students, our members of our student government boards, as well as other students who worked hard on that Pitt Community Compact. That community compact has been shared with faculty and staff, as well as our regional campuses. And we have significant buy-in and commitment to that compact. And that's one of our approaches, is to create a culture and identify behavior that we believe is really helpful and will support a healthy community. But it doesn't end there. I think that's a really important part. And we believe, and I have faith personally, that our community is made up of good people who have the best interests of the community in mind. But we also know that there are concerns about compliance. And so on the other hand, we've also created a very specific and clear student code of conduct provision that basically says that students who fail to comply with our public health guidance, whether it's from the University of Pittsburgh or our health agencies within the state or local, could face penalties through our student code of conduct and consequences. So we believe that the two of those things combined really create a great foundation for the fall, and that we're relying on our folks to do the right thing and support each other and be healthy and safe and be mindful of other people's health. But for those community members who do not support that and do not support this idea that we are responsible for each other and we play a part in the community safety, we do have our student code of conduct for students. Our human resources office will be supporting and following up with faculty and staff who violate our standards and guidelines. And we're serious about both. We're very serious about the culture that we're trying to create with the compact, and we're very serious about the consequences for people who willfully put other people in harm's way. It will require all of us as a community to be active bystanders and work with folks if you see things happening, to interject and talk to them about their behavior. And then in cases where you see someone violating or putting others at risk, there is a process for reporting those incidents to us, including our conduct system for students.
Okay, thank you so much, Kenyon. John, I'm going to switch gears and we have a lot of health questions. So this is the first one for you. Other universities are testing every student using rapid pooled COVID-19 testing before putting students together in housing. Why has Pitt decided not to do this? Wouldn't testing students before they move into suites, doubles, and unmask themselves with others in their pod prevent at least some infection from coming through? Can you speak to this question?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Julia, and one that we hear a lot. And I just want to say first to the students, we appreciate your engagement. I'm looking at all these questions and trying to answer them in the slide as I can. You might be doing a lot better than the faculty town hall last week, but you didn't hear that from me. So it's a common question that people say, well, why not just test everybody? And I want to reiterate something that Kenyon just said. You know, the way to control virus spread and our best tool to manage this pandemic is face masks, hand hygiene, and social distancing. In fact, if we all did that well, we wouldn't really need that much testing. That said, testing is a very important tool. The American Collegiate Health Association, the CDC, Pennsylvania Department of Health, and every other state department of health that I'm aware of, don't recommend, in fact, they explicitly recommend against mass testing of asymptomatic people. Why is that? Because it seems so intuitive. We'll just test everybody. The reason is, number one, that there's a long window period of false negatives. You've all heard about false negatives. A single PCR test is actually very poor at excluding infection because the virus has to slowly grow in the nose and then become detectable. So for that to work, you'd have to be testing people every other day. So a single test not only doesn't exclude infection, it creates a false sense of security. People feel like, well, I tested negative, I'm good. And in fact, many of the schools that are doing this mass testing, which not all are not requiring any quarantine or shelter in place. That's a real mistake because that negative test is going to create a false sense of security, and the shelter in place and isolation is much more important. Another reason that it's not recommended is, and this is where it just won't be functional, as many of you know from looking at the media, wherever you get your news, current turnaround time for tests is in the days to even weeks at most large commercial labs. So a test done before a student arrives on campus, when the results aren't coming back for a week, that doesn't help you manage that student when they arrive on campus or in the campus area. Again, much more important is the isolation, the shelter in place. However, you do want to have a sense of what is the prevalence in your community. So we're doing two kinds of testing. One is a statistically systematic random subsampling testing. That's a time-honored way to know what's the prevalence of disease in a population. And we've worked with statisticians and epidemiologists in the Pitt Graduate School of Public Health to determine how many students do we need to test randomly to know what is our local prevalence. And that number ends up being in the neighborhood of 10%. So students will be tested randomly during arrival over the staged days of arrival. This tells us two things. One is it tells us what is the prevalence right now in our population, not a week ago, not 5 days ago, right now. And because we have a staged arrival, it gives us the flexibility that Steve talked about. We're not bringing everybody at once and then we find out, oh my gosh, the rates are higher than we thought. We bring people in cohorts and those students will be tested and we'll know within 24 hours so that we can adjust our rate of arrival on campus. We will continue doing systematic random surveillance every couple of weeks during the semester so that, again, we know the point prevalence. The other kind of testing we're doing beyond the surveillance testing is symptomatic testing. Students who have symptoms consistent with COVID will be tested and we'll get those results back within 24 hours.
So a little bit more on testing, a follow-up
Yeah.
question to that. How will the first test be done? Do students, is it in their residence hall? Do they go to UPMC? What does an actual test look like? What can they expect?
Really good question. Students are definitely doing better than the faculty. Okay, so this will be done, the symptomatic testing will be done in a clinical setting if students have symptoms, probably in student health for most of them. But the surveillance testing will be done in outdoor testing locations that will be constructed that are socially distanced and safe, and it will be at a central location in Oakland. The testing will be done by students doing a self-collected nasal swab, which data has shown to be as valid and safer for both the student and the collector than a nasopharyngeal swab. And having had many of these done on myself to train people, self-collected nasal is easier than nasopharyngeal. And that test will be tested by PCR so that we'll know is the virus there at this moment, and we'll get that result back within about a day.
So one final question around testing. Can students be tested prior to arrival on campus instead, prior to the time they come to campus? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, students absolutely can. And I would, caution you to put too much weight on that. Again, I'm glad my kid's college that he's going back to this year is not doing mass testing. And I'm glad because I have friends' kids that are getting mass tested and then they're just being set free on the campus. So yes, it's fine if you can arrange testing at home, although remember the turnaround right now, if most people go to say their PCP or Rite Aid or CVS for a test as an asymptomatic person, it's probably going to take a week to get back. And that doesn't really say anything about, do you have virus in your nose? Even if students are tested at home, it's important to maintain that social distancing. I think the best example of the limitations of testing are in the highly public figures in the White House administration who are tested daily and yet people still become infected because they're not observing proper social distancing. So the social distancing, the mask, the hand hygiene, much more important really than the test in managing risk.
Okay. Well, oh, one last question for you. Thank you so much for sharing information on testing. There were a lot of questions on testing. There's also a lot of questions on quarantining. Can you walk us through what the quarantine guidelines will be for students?
I will, and I just want to clarify two terms that anybody who's not deep in the weeds of this, like somebody me has or our epidemiologist for decades, isolation is for people who are infected or suspected to be infected. So if you have symptoms, okay, or you're proven COVID positive, that's isolation. And we have separate isolation beds for those students to go to where food will be delivered until they're through the isolation period and can return to their housing. Quarantine is a risk reduction strategy to try and prevent exposure of others if somebody is suspected to be infected. So if a student develops symptoms and tests positive, that student goes into isolation. Anybody that they have been in contact with would then be in quarantine while they either stay in quarantine or get tested to see if they have been infected by that contact. And quarantine usually is in the place where the person resides. And for example, I saw a question about food. Food will be delivered to people while they're in quarantine.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Amanda, we have a number of questions around the grad student experience. Can you answer the first one, which is, are graduate students permitted to attend classes 100% virtually? There's still some confusion around that.
Thank you, Julia. Well, first I want to say welcome to all the graduate and professional students. Thank you for tuning into this town hall. And we know that there are specific questions that you have that are specific to graduate studies. So are graduate students permitted to attend classes 100% remotely? The answer is mostly. Most graduate classes are also designed for the Flex at Pitt model that Joe described, meaning that you can choose whether to attend in person or remotely, and you can change your mind at any time. There are some graduate programs that require experiences like practicum, clinics, and experiences that really have to be face-to-face, both for the program and also for licensing or credentialing. So our advice to you would be to contact your program in these cases, particularly if you see in the curriculum that there are some courses marked clinics or practicum. I also wanted to address another question that is important to us and that came up in the question and answer, and that is whether or not TAs and TFs can choose whether or not to teach remotely or in person. And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. Just as with everyone else in the Pitt community, with the Pitt at Flex model, TAs and TFs have the choice to teach remotely if they feel they need to do so for their safety and comfort.
Thank you. Another question that we received, a lot of questions around research and labs. So this one student said, does the university have an official word on whether or not students can return to working in research labs on campus, or is it up to the department the lab is associated with? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is both. The university has safety guidelines for on-campus research that all labs and researchers have to adhere to. And each lab or researcher not only has to follow these guidelines, but they have to submit a research plan to the university that they will follow, and that follows those safety guidelines. You can find out more about those safety guidelines on Pitt's COVID-19 standards and guidance website, which we're going to provide a link to. And I also wanted to mention, particularly for graduate student researchers and other graduate students, that there is an online form that you can fill out, either anonymously or with your name, if you have concerns about safety in any labs.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, somewhat related, is have any decisions been made in regards to internships, externships, and field placements for graduate students?
The answer is yes. That information is also available on the COVID-19 Standards and Guidelines website. But in short, we require that internships and externships meet or exceed the safety standards required by Pitt. And if you want more details about that, given the specific internship or clinical experience that is part of your curriculum, we'd suggest that you contact your program for more specific details.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to move to Belkis. So we have so many questions. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to represent. So Belkis, thank you so much for joining us. What is the latest guidance coming from the U.S. U.S. government regarding my educational experience while I'm in country? Can you speak to there's been a lot of movement for international students in recent weeks. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure, Julia, and to all of our international undergraduate and graduate students out there, we welcome you and we thank you for your patience and your flexibility over the past few weeks. As Julia's mentioned, we know that you've been watching carefully all of the regulatory information that has been released by the U.S. Department of State. So this is where we are today. The Student and Exchange Visitor Program in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement section of the U.S. Department of State has issued a frequently asked questions document for universities to follow with respect to international students who are enrolled in courses for fall 2020. That new frequently asked questions document replaces any of the other directives, including the July 6th directive that was blocking students from participating in online instruction. So on July 24th, ICE issued clarifying questions to also supplement their guidance. At this point, what we know is that incoming, or what SEVP calls initial students, first year students, can, if you already have a visa in hand, come to the United States and complete and enroll in courses that are part of the Flex at Pitt model. As Joe has mentioned and Amanda has reiterated, Pitt is employing a hybrid educational model called Flex at Pitt that allows all of our international students to enroll in courses understanding that there will be moments of in-person instruction and there may be moments of remote learning depending on the university's risk posture, as was already explained.
Oh, excuse me. Does the current policy also apply to continuing F1 international students with active SEVIS account records?
Yes, thank you. So continuing international students who have an active SEVIS record and are enrolled in an F1 visa can take classes using the Flex at Pitt model. They can take them from the United States if they're already here. If they have a visa and travel restrictions allow, they can return to campus and enroll in the Flex at Pitt model. But as Joe and Amanda have also mentioned, if they prefer to continue their experience remotely and remain at home, we do have options for continuing students to enroll in remote coursework this fall.
And is the same true for new international students?
That's a great question, Julie. And I think here it's important to take note of a few differences. If you are a new international student, whether you're in an undergraduate program or a graduate program and you're scheduled to start classes in the fall, a few things you need to remember. One, new international students outside of the United States who will remain outside of the United States for the fall may take classes 100% online. You may enroll in the Flex at Pitt model. You may also enroll in a remote learning abroad model, and there's more information available to you online. The second thing to remember is that international students with an initial SEVIS I-20 may not enter the United States to take only online classes. So we encourage international students with an initial CVIS I-20 that intend to come to the United States to work with your academic advisor to ensure that you at least have one, if not more courses, as Joe mentioned, that are denoted as having an in-person instructional opportunity so that you may remain in the United States safely. And the final thing is that our reading for new international students with an initial CVIS I-20 is that you may enter the United States if you are scheduled for a hybrid program like Flex at Pitt. So if you are planning to come to campus, your initial CVIS I-20, and you have your visa in hand, you can plan to enter the United States, and we will be making a notation in your I-20 to explain the Flex at Pitt hybrid model to Customs and Border Enforcement personnel for their information.
Great, thank you so much. So we are getting quite a few questions in through the Q&A feature, and I want to move to some of those. We're working hard to answer them in text, but there's also a handful that I'd like to pose to the panelists. Joe, a question came in that said, if you're completely remote in your courses, will tuition change in price? Can you speak to that?
Sure, I absolutely can. Let me start off by reminding people that completely remote is a fungible choice, meaning that you can actually change that decision at any time, right? We want students to have that flexibility so that you don't have the added anxiety of trying to make a decision today that impacts you for the entire semester or possibly for the entire academic year. So for this entire academic year, students have the option of switching between in-person and remote at any time. We understand, though, having said that, we understand that this is a difficult time financially for a lot of people, and the university is not immune to this, right? The university has had a lot of rising fixed costs. As I mentioned earlier, we've been adding lots of technology to ensure that we can deliver this Flex at Pitt model to deliver the best possible educational experience for our students. We still have the same world-class faculty that we've always had that are going to be involved with teaching you and your children, depending on who's listening. And so we have a difficult financial situation to deal with as well. But in recognition of how difficult it is on all of you, we're not cutting any of our financial aid programs. In fact, those have increased this year compared to last year. And at the same time, we're keeping all of our tuition rates across all 5 campuses flat, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And in consultation with some of our student government leaders, we are reducing the student activity fees. Those were it was a recommendation from all of the student leaders across the campuses. So the student activity fees will be decreasing, but there will not be a differential tuition between those that engage remotely and those that engage in person, in large part because they can change their mind at any time, and we don't want to lock them into that decision.
Okay, we had a number of questions after you spoke around Flex at Pitt and around students understanding if their class is remote or not. Can you talk to when you think classes will be listed as TBA for a student? Like, when will the location be confirmed? And in addition, if a course lists an actual location right now, does that mean it's in person or online? There's still some questions there.
Sure. And I recognize it's a very stressful situation. It's a difficult time. Let me say that classes that do have physical locations listed in PeopleSoft right now are incredibly likely, 97% chance that that class is going to take place in that physical location, and a student does have the option of engaging in that class in person. Again, they're not required to, they can still choose remote, but they have the option of engaging in person in that physical class. If instead your class is listed as TBA or web TBA, if it's a lecture style class, we are still working to find a room to move that to. Again, there's about 15% of those types of classes that we have not yet placed, but that means the vast majority, 85% of them have been placed. So I just implore you to give us a little bit of grace, give us a little bit of extra time where renting out different spaces across the Oakland community to make sure that we have safe spaces. And we're doing this as rapidly as we can. I can't give you a timeline, but every day we're knocking down tens, if not hundreds, of the remaining classes. We have about 450 left to go.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. Steve, there's a number of questions still around move-in and residence life. So one question was, will a student be able to begin the semester at home and then move into residence halls midway through the semester? Is that possible?
Thanks, Jay. Sorry, I've been busy trying to respond to people's questions, but yes, if they have their assignment and they're moving in, they can move in when they choose to from that capacity. But we would ask folks again to shelter in place. So if they're beginning the semester remotely, to sort of reach out on an individual basis to navigate those specific logistics with us, is what I would say.
If students received their move-in date and they have conflicts and they want to talk about it, can they change the move-in date?
So what we're trying to do, and I'll give the big picture answer of this. So let me use Tower A as an example. So for Tower A floor, if you live on floor 3, we have assigned those move-in dates to get the entire floor to move in on the same day. We do understand there's some logistics. And so what we ask, we are being a little bit inconvenienced and we understand that, but we're really trying to coordinate and emphasize the health of the entire community and trying to keep people's dates to the dates that they've arrived. If there is some significant logistical necessity, please reach out. But again, we are asking folks to really be flexible and work with us if that is possible. We do understand there are challenges, issues that we will have to work with, but we're really hoping that people will understand the emphasis on community health and appreciate the question, Julia.
Another question around the residence hall. Will guests be allowed in residence halls?
Yeah, so we're going to start the semester off with not allowing outside guests into the residence hall. And again, similar to the reasons, we're trying to maintain community health and navigate the welfare of everybody as we begin this semester. And then we will continue to assess it based upon the healthcare and the medical team's guidance and what posture we are in as we navigate the semester.
Kenyon, we had a number of questions around orientation and welcome week. Will most of the welcome week activities be online since many of these students will not have moved in yet during their quarantine or their shelter in place period?
Yes. Virtually all of our welcome week activities will be in remote mode, so virtual welcome week activities. That schedule will be published and additional information. But yes, so just to accommodate, number one, the guidelines that we've put in place for students to shelter in place, and to acknowledge that not all of our students will be in Pittsburgh or on campus during the welcome week activities. It makes most sense for us to offer that virtually. So yes.
There's been a number of questions just around conduct violations. So people gathering in large groups or conduct violations associated with the community compact. Can you speak to what happens to a student in that situation?
Yeah, I know that there's a number of questions about that, and I think people want specifics, exactly what we'll do. This is what I'll say, that we've been very clear about what our standards and guidelines are and our expectations for students, particularly about face covering and social distancing and who's permitted in our buildings. Just like every other year, we have a student code of conduct and we have universities' policies and procedures, and we expect members of our community to adhere to those policies and procedures. We are not treating our guidelines and policies and guidance for public health reasons any less serious than those other policies that we have. So students who violate and are referred to this Office of Student Code of Conduct, and I'm speaking specifically for students in my role as Dean of Students, they will go through our conduct process, which everyone deserves due process. So based on the facts presented at the case, the student will have an opportunity to give us their side of what happened, and then the conduct hearing officers will decide if the student is responsible. If the student is responsible, there are a number of sanctions that could be imposed for that student. Something as on one end of the scale, education, so that the student is more informed about what the expectations are for the community, all the way up to suspension or dismissal from the university. All of those are on the table depending on their behavior and whether or not the student is willing to support and comply with the guidance that we've put in place to protect the community. So we are serious. I am serious. The process is serious. We hope that we don't have to use the process, but the process is there to be used. And students who fail to comply and really are mindful of the health and wellness of others in the community will face consequences, up to including suspension from the university or loss of privileges to facilities, buildings, or classes. I hope that's clear enough.
Thank you. You know, we've been getting a lot of questions around parents and students who have questions around move-in, and they're calling Panther Central. Can you speak to a little bit about some of the structures that have just recently been put in place to handle the volume to make sure that we are trying to communicate and answer questions as best we can?
Yes, yeah. Thank you for asking that. Whoever asked that, I think this is first of all, I want to acknowledge that we've sent out a lot of information in the past week or past couple of weeks. All of it is very important, but it's a lot of information, and we will continue to send out information. In fact, we'll be sending out information about our culture and compliance tomorrow, and we'll have more to follow. So I want to say that we acknowledge that we're sending you a lot of information, and therefore there are lots of questions, and many of those questions are really good questions. We've realized that we have not responded to those questions effectively. And there are folks who have not been able to talk to someone or get a response. And so many of us have come up with ways to be better responsive to your questions and concerns. So working with Panther Central, that team has done a great job of working with other folks around the university, the Office of the Provost, our Residence Life Spot, office, student affairs, our student health center, to get more people on board to answer those questions. So we've set up a call center, and hopefully within the next few days, you'll see a difference in our responsiveness. In addition to that, we're also working to stand up more of a virtual environment where we would have hours each day of the week where people can just Zoom connect to one of our Zoom open sort of office hours, walk-in appointments. And pretty much in the fashion that we're doing today, just maybe less structured, you'll be able to ask questions from people who will be ready to answer those questions. So we're responding. We have a plan in place, and hopefully you'll see a difference within the next few days. I would say, please don't hesitate to reach out to my office. My email address is deanofstudents@pitt.edu if you have a specific question. If you have a question that's very specific to your situation, we will take those questions, but we may refer you to a specific office that can help you specifically. More general questions will also continue to populate the COVID-19 coronavirus.pitt.edu site, where we'll have an FAQ. And there's also lots of information that we'll be providing after this webinar, so with links and resources to where information can be found.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Joe, I'm going to throw it to you. There's been quite a bit of questions coming in around people who might have conflicts with their move-in with a class that is being scheduled. Can you talk a little bit about synchronous and asynchronous learning as those conflicts may have emerged in their move-in dates?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And I apologize to the group that, Flex at Pitt is a little bit complicated. And so it was hard for me to capture in words, which is why I'll reiterate that we're going to put that infographic up just as soon as we have it as clear as we can make it. But one of the other strengths of Flex at Pitt is that the vast majority of our classroom meetings, because they're offered in both an in-person and a remote modality, we'll be able to record that remote modality and be able to post that online for students to engage with when they're not, when it's not during the classroom period. This is done both to accommodate students that may be in a different time zone, that it's inconvenient for them to engage synchronously, meaning during the class time, but it'll also impact those that need to move in possibly during their normally scheduled class time. So you might miss that first day of class, but that class will be available to be watched at a later time. And this will even be a great study aid, frankly, for students that want to go back and refresh their memory on a particularly important topic that they covered during the semester at some point.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. I know there are many, many questions that came in, and we are going to continue to respond and answer those. I want to thank you for your time just tuning in and giving us those questions. I want to reiterate that we will have a recording of the town hall on the website called pi.tt/student town halls. All the Q&As and frequently asked questions and links that were mentioned throughout the town hall will also be listed on the site. So thanks again, and hope that your move-in goes smooth. Take care.